Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute or two as everyone comes in from the waiting room. Feel free to go ahead and introduce yourselves and where you're calling in from in the chat. Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. As people are coming in from the waiting room, feel free to go ahead and introduce yourselves and where you're from in the chat. Uh, I'm seeing messages that the chat is disabled. We can fix that. Attendees. Okay. Thanks, everyone, for calling attention to that. Does it work now? Great. All right, we'll give it about 30 more seconds for people to come in from the waiting room. I'm seeing a ton of introductions flowing in. Really great to see. Apologies that we did not have that set up at the beginning. All right, I think our waiting room is slowing down a bit. Feel free to continue introducing yourselves in the chat to each other, but we can get started because we have a really exciting agenda for today. My name is Courtney Cooperman. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a housing advocacy organizer at NLIHC. I'm really excited to welcome you to what is now the 9th webinar in the Our Homes, Our Votes 2022 bi-weekly webinar series. And our theme today is getting candidates on the record on housing and homelessness. We're really excited to welcome Lisa Chapman from the Michigan Coalition Against Homelessness and Israel Baer from International Network of Street Papers North America to speak on this topic. Unfortunately, two of our scheduled panelists, Kelly Sue and Stephanie from the Bedford County Listening Project, are actually having an internet outage in their town that won't be resolved until tomorrow, so they won't be available to join us on the panel today. But the good news is that we have them rescheduled for our webinar on October 3rd, which will focus on overcoming voter suppression. So we'll still have a chance to learn from them at a later date. And as always, just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded. The recording and resources will be sent out to you within the next few days afterwards. We'll have some time to ask questions for each of our panelists, so please use the Q&A box throughout the session, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. And with that, I will hand it over to Lisa to get us started.
Thank you, Courtney. Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa. I use she, her pronouns. So glad to be here with you today. Hoping that my slides are available somewhere. You can cue them up. Just wanted to thank you again. Oh, there we are. Thank you. You can go to the next slide. So some of these slides are adapted from webinars that we have hosted targeted to our members, the public, and our collaborative partners in the homeless response system and affordable housing arena. Part of our effort is to try to appeal to people about voting in a variety of ways using inspirational quotes, visuals, and data and statistics. This quote from the late Congressman John Lewis is a favorite. You can see sign language as well. Next slide. A little bit of background too. Michigan Coalition Against Homelessness, or MICA. Our Homes, Our Votes work centered around 3 pillars: voter education, voter registration, and candidate outreach and engagement. We are trying to garner some interest and urgency around the 2022 election in a non-presidential voting year by stressing the importance of participation by voters to support the candidates that align with their values and priorities. An interesting Michigan election tidbit. This year in Michigan, we had 10 Republican candidates that were interested in attempting to get on the primary ballot to run for governor. 5 of them were disqualified due to fraud on the part of the company hired by their campaign for the signature gathering process. So they were not able to be placed on the primary ballot. MICA staff and interns reviewed survey formats from the last election in 2020, and we cut down the number of questions and focused mostly on the candidates' knowledge, views on housing, and homeless response priorities. We created a state-level survey for our legislature, a different one for our Congress members, and a third one for Michigan governor, attorney general, and secretary of state candidates. In all, we ended up with 22 questions for the state legislature survey, which was the longest. We asked them about several pieces of pending state legislation. We mixed in a few open-ended questions with multiple choice responses as well. The biggest change this year was that we decided to do all electronic surveys. In the past, they were mailed out in the US mail and hand tabulated. We worked closely with our communications manager, Amy, to enable the responses to go to the back end of our website and right into a spreadsheet, which saved us a lot of manpower hours. This will ease in the analysis, sharing, and dissemination of the information electronically. Getting valid emails for all the candidates was a huge challenge, especially the non-incumbents. So we started out using publicly available information on Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, and by contacting the Michigan Elections Bureau. One of our interns had worked as a local reporter in the 2020 election, and he helped us play detective and find many of the email addresses. Most helpful were the clerks. Michigan has 83 counties, 280 cities, and 1,240 townships, and clerks can be found at all 3 levels. They were the absolute best in responding in a timely manner to us and having accurate contact information for the candidates. Surveys were sent out at the end of June and early July, requesting a short turnaround of 2 weeks, so they would not be set aside and forgotten. I received several calls right after the surveys were sent out to clarify the purpose for the information, and also some responses from candidates that they had never heard of us and that they were looking forward to working with us after the election. One candidate for State House told me that he had previously been homeless, but his family had resolved the homelessness on their own without intervention. So far, a total of 66 surveys have been returned of the 148 for the state legislature and 6 of 13 for the congressional races, which is about a 45% response rate overall. We have received none thus far from the state executive level races. Once the primary is over next week, we will go through and follow up with the remaining candidates that prevailed in the primary who have not returned our surveys. Our plans include posting the information gleaned from the surveys on our website, creating regional and district information on candidate responses, as well as doing one-pagers highlighting some of the statistics on priorities the candidate mentioned, as well as views on housing and homelessness issues, such as blank percentage of candidates support source of income protections, which is one of our pending state bills, or this number support funding for affordable housing, and so on. Next slide, please. We also encouraged our partners to partner with us, our local COCs and community agencies, to host several town halls or roundtable forums in local communities. MICA would help promote and facilitate, and candidates would be asked specific questions on their views on housing and homelessness, their priorities, and other local issues. Once the primary is over, we plan to do some targeted outreach to partners in specific areas of the state to host these candidate forums, but we've made the invitation statewide. We'll most likely do it virtually, especially in some of the targeted races where incumbents are running against each other due to redistricting, or in areas with high housing scarcity and high market areas. As well, we are doing some in-person events. We are doing community connect events where we will have a table on voting and voting resources and information. We had pens made with "Housing is Built with Ballots" and our website on it as a giveaway item. We have events slated for Detroit, near Lansing and Flint, and one slated for September in Macomb County on National Voter Registration Day. Next slide, please. MICA is using all of its social media channels to push out our Homes, Our Votes content, such as promoting voting, information on the upcoming primary, the absentee ballot, which is Michigan's version of early voting called Vote at Home, the webinars we are producing, resources and toolkits, along with statistics on voter participation, such as, although nearly 60% of unhoused persons are eligible to vote in the US, 1 in 3 is registered, and as few as 1 in 10 actually do vote. We can do better. Next slide, please. We are also producing webinars, resources, and repurposing some previously recorded video testimonials on why I vote from persons with lived expertise. We are also sharing recorded video on voting while homeless from our Secretary of State. We are posting materials on newly made election pages on the MICA website, where the candidate survey information will also be housed. Next slide, please. We are really trying to drive the message home that each person's vote is just as important as anyone else's and has equal weight. Voting gives us the power to elevate people into positions of power who support our vision of the future. It is our civic duty. Democracy is participatory and one of our responsibilities as citizens. Voting produces change, and exercising and affirming the right to vote is an important way to show that we, the people, will not relinquish that right. Next slide, please. So that's it. I'd be happy to answer any questions. I think we have a link, or you're going to share the example of the state level survey. And I just want to thank everyone.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Yeah, I think if I can get screen sharing capacity, then I will screen share the state survey, and then maybe I can just kind of scroll through it. And if you want to, Lisa, actually, I was going to ask the question of how did you go about coming up with these questions and determining what to ask?
Yeah.
I'm not sure if others can see my screen or if you're still seeing.
No.
Let me see. We might have to end the screen share. Okay.
Okay. So while you're doing that, I'll answer. So I have 3 fabulous interns who are working with us this year, and we looked at. MICA's always done a lot of election work and partnered with our partners at National Low Income Housing Coalition, and we've done candidate surveys for a long, long time. So we looked at surveys that we've done in the past. We really wanted to cut down a little bit, but still, there's a balance between what's important information for voters and people that are unhoused and partners in homeless response and housing to know about the candidates versus, what's going to take them a half an hour to complete. So we really tried to cut it down a little bit while still, having and asking a lot of the important questions. So I can see the top of it. So this is our state level survey. So we just asked them, what are important surveys? How important do you think it's to find solutions? And then we had some forced choice questions, some ranked, what's important, what's not important. Asked about different target populations, what are important policies, priorities. A couple questions about affordable housing, because Michigan is really behind, as are many areas of the state. A couple questions about bills that we have pending and their support of them. What do they feel the government's role is in addressing issues? Are our communities addressing homelessness effectively? What's the role of, poverty reduction? Things like that. And then at the end, there's a couple open questions. This is our 2020 level of homelessness. What do you think can be done? What's going on in your area? What are additional thoughts? And will you champion these issues if you're elected?
Thank you. Yeah, this is really, really cool. Did you mention that has it always been done online, or was it typically in print?
No, this is the first year we've done it electronically like this. And you think that candidates running for office would want to have their email addresses publicly available, but not so much. So the incumbents were easy to find. People that maybe had, a vote for Lisa Chapman website, maybe it was easier, but we had to beat the bushes for quite a few. So the clerks were the best way that we found to get those email addresses.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're doing follow-up to get those that haven't returned them. And then certainly once the primary narrows candidates down, we will be circling back to those that we have not heard from yet.
Great. And we got a question in the chat from Nzinga about whether there's an event date set for Detroit.
We just did Detroit on Friday. We were at the Empowerment Project. But invite us. We'll be happy to come out and do other ones.
Awesome. Kind of on a related note, I was wondering if you could just talk more about the process of planning those events that you do with partners and what makes those successful.
So a lot of communities do what we call Homeless Connect events. So it's kind of like a fair, if you will, with exhibit, with vendors, with booths, and also include definitely links to housing providers, hopefully open housing that people that are unhoused could go to that day or apply for, in short order. Resources like haircuts and clothing and food and, all kinds of helpful things for folks. And we've applied as a vendor to be there to talk about, we had voter registration forms, we had absentee ballot forms, we had a lot of information, the posters that we repurposed from 2 years ago that are still wonderful. And we just put it out there to all of our continuums of care across the state, saying that we would love to partner with you. And we've heard from some, and we're going to continue to be offering the opportunity. Both, we email them, we put it on our social media, and we also have staff that attend each of the continuum of care meetings. So we do it in multiple ways, and hopefully we'll have a couple a month, and we're taking turns, the interns and I, on partnering on doing those. And it's just really great. We had people that were unhoused on Friday, as well as staff of a couple shelters who took a lot of information back to their participants.
Great. That sort of brings me to my next question. So once you collect all this information about the candidates' positions, how do you convey those to the public to help them to make informed choices when voting on issues of housing and homelessness?
So in the past, we've posted the actual links to all the surveys, which we will do again. And then we're also hoping to create some regional content, some one-pagers on statistics. This percentage of state legislators that responded support, this legislation or support an increase in affordable housing funding, things like that. We also will use those for our social media informational pieces, and also we're planning on doing more webinars, and also for the town halls that we hope to do.
Great. One thing that's really important with all of these efforts, with everything, Our Homes, Our Votes, is keeping things really strictly nonpartisan. And that can, of course, be a challenge when working with candidates who are they're running, and it's in a very partisan way. So, what do you do to make sure that all of the candidate questionnaire and all of the events follow all of the rules of nonpartisanship?
Well, we've offered to help facilitate. One thing that we plan on doing is having a set question list, and we will, offer participation to all the candidates, and hopefully they will all, take us up on the offer. And, just really, yes, like you said, being nonpartisan, asking the same questions to the same each candidate, offering them equal opportunity to, equal time, equal opportunity to weigh in on each of the issues.
For sure. I know there's also some guidelines around, for example, if they're doing a site visit, it should be in their official capacity, not candidate capacity. And there's limits on what they can talk about and what capacity they can be visiting in, just to make sure that everything is really nonpartisan and there's nothing that could even possibly be conceived as an endorsement happening. For sure.
Exactly.
Great. And then so we have a question from Mrs. Brown about addressing the needs of elderly and disabled people who may not be computer savvy. Is there a way to facilitate access to the survey questions for them?
If we did have somebody who had challenges with the technology, and we've assisted that candidate, and if people reach out to us, they have my phone number and my email address, as well as our website, and we monitor that. If anybody has any questions or any of our social media challenges, we will definitely help them. People can fill it out verbally as well if they'd rather do it over a phone call or Zoom. We just are interested in hearing back from them and getting the information to be able to push it out to our community partners.
Totally. I'm not seeing any other questions specifically to your presentation, so I think I'm gonna pass it over to Israel now, but thank you so much for being here. We love working with you and seeing all of your voter and candidate engagement coming together. So I'm gonna pass it over to Israel now. Thank you, Lisa.
So much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Israel Baer, and I'm with the International Network of Street Papers. And for those that aren't familiar with the street paper, there are about 100 street papers in 35 countries in 25 languages around the world that serve people experiencing homelessness and poverty by selling a paper on street corners and in the public. And we have 25 papers in the United States, and we work very closely with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition on a variety of different things. But I'm here to talk today just a little bit about some different ideas and engaging the media on how to get candidates on the record, and some different things that we've seen that are pretty creative and unique, and then some just kind of basic tenets that your organization can think about. One of the things that I think that we often forget or don't engage is being able to go and visit our local editorial boards, whether that's a big newspaper, whether that's a small newspaper. But if it's possible at all to visit your editorial boards, brief them on your housing agenda, and really ask them to engage in the issue and engage candidates on the issue, it can go a really long way for both informing that local newspaper of the issues, but it can also really put on their radar that they need to include housing and homelessness in any of the coverage that they're doing in relationship to their own work that they're doing around candidate engagement. And, another thing that I think that oftentimes we can be thinking about is to sit down and do one-on-one with local reporters. Oftentimes there will be reporters that are engaging, doing candidate coverage or election coverage, and just making sure that, whoever that reporter is in your local region, that you've had the opportunity to sit down with them and really walk through the priorities of again, your agenda, what's happening, some different nuances around different things that may be occurring both locally and nationally around housing, and just making sure that those reporters are briefed. And again, much like the editorial boards, just making sure that they're working housing into their coverage and kind of the frame at which they're thinking that housing falls in to the lens in which they're thinking about how to cover the issue. So those are really can be really important things to engage the media. Some other really creative ideas that we've seen is community groups approaching their local media, whether that be a small town newspaper, whether that be a community newspaper, whether that be a larger newspaper, and asking them to actually partner on doing a candidate interview in their publication. And it really provides the opportunity for that publication to cover the issue, to cover candidates. And so oftentimes, maybe a daily is not going to do that, or even a weekly, but oftentimes community newspapers and others that like certain groups might work with. An example might be approaching your local AARP and saying, hey, let's get together and figure out a set of questions to ask all the candidates that cross over our issues, and utilizing other groups that have a media presence or a large base that they're actually getting publications out to can be a really creative way to think about how to engage the candidates. Obviously, like Lisa talked about and Courtney talked about, you have to be able to ask all of the candidates. You have to be able to be nonpartisan and ask the same questions. But it really provides an opportunity to leverage voters in a different way by working with media to engage in the issue. Sometimes we've seen, different intersections of issues work together, whether it be climate justice or whether it be a variety of different stuff, and say, hey, let's approach a local media publication or a particular outlet, and let's ask if we could be a part of partnering with them to provide a platform to readers to be able to talk about these issues. So those are some creative ways. I think in smaller and suburban towns, it really helps in them to think about content in a different way. It really can, oftentimes with candidates, they provide such boilerplate, oftentimes, not always, they offer a lot of boilerplate language unless they're really passionate and educated about the issue. And I think by working with the media, it attracts them. Obviously, they want to be heard, they want to be seen. They're going to take the time to utilize that opportunity to be able to get their voice out there and their campaign out there. So oftentimes it attracts candidates that otherwise might just ignore you, or if you feel isolated in a particular part of a region or a state, it can really help leverage the opportunity to engage candidates that otherwise might not engage. The same can be done with community radio stations. So often we kind of look over those groups and we just think about how we're going to maximize the big media, but oftentimes, obviously in local communities, rural communities, it could be your local radio station that's actually reaching a wider audience than your state's daily newspaper. And so it's really to think about radio in a different way. There's creative ways very similar to working with local newspapers that you can set up a forum, or it could be an evening where they take 2 hours out and do either a debate or a lively conversation on the radio about the issues that you're working with. So those are all some creative ways to obviously engage candidates through the media that are just really important. And really you're talking to two bases. You're talking to a readership of the media, you're talking to voters, and obviously you're talking to candidates. So you can really think about hitting a broad audience. Obviously, the good old like write a letter to the editor. I think it's really important that we take the time to do that, and especially during an election season. Obviously, you want to be nonpartisan. Maybe you're not even mentioning candidates, but you are talking about the importance of government and housing as a public infrastructure, and the importance of what housing means during elections, and really just peppering local newspapers, community newspapers, the bigger media with that message helps generate their campaigns to see that that issue is something that voters and readers care about, and oftentimes will then help leverage them to think about how to talk about the issue in a more sophisticated way. Using your own channels, much like Lisa talked about, a lot of, statewide groups or community groups will do some kind of survey. Oftentimes there can be a candidates forum as well, or a town house. Those are always great, and I really encourage those. Those always seem to be very popular. Another way you can think about engaging stuff that I've seen work really successful with some of the smaller media is inviting the candidates in either together or one-on-one, and actually getting them to do a more formal interview on video, and then really blasting that out on your social channels, your newsletters, your YouTube channels, et cetera, et cetera. All of those are really ways to be able to get the candidates on the record. You're meeting with them in person, and it's just a great way to be able to engage candidates. And then I think that like trying to use social media in a creative way, if you're doing a candidates forum or a town hall, or however you're engaging, making sure you're live tweeting, making sure you're promoting your social channels prior to the event, and really make it something that is an event online. And so, when you're able to live tweet candidates forums, people are engaging in that, other people are retweeting that, you're growing your social media base, and sometimes we've seen that start to trend locally, and obviously your issues out there. So making sure that however you're utilizing your work, that you're really using your social media channels in a sophisticated way. If that was a survey, if that was again, any number of things that interviews, you can take after that chunks of those surveys, chunks of those interviews, and do a Twitter thread about each candidate, how they answered the questions, et cetera, et cetera. You could do that all at once. You could say every Tuesday, we're going to do a live Twitter thread, or just a regular Twitter thread where we're providing the answers to questions that we've asked to really engage the larger public. So those are all ways that we're seeing people be able to engage candidates through the media. I really encourage, it's so important as a media outlet to be able to be hearing from different organizations and people about what they're seeing on the ground. And so when we're informed by local community partners and by thought leaders and people with lived experience, et cetera, we're better able to shape the questions that we have. Because, oftentimes an editorial board, if they haven't been briefed on the issue, they're all just sitting around coming up with questions that they have on their own, and they may not be understanding the nuances that are happening on the ground. They may not know when to push back on a candidate if they're kind of just offering that boilerplate language. And so really by engaging your media partners and/or your media in your local community, you're able to really try to reshape how the conversation is happening in your community. So that's all I have. Just some creative ideas and thoughts around how to engage the media. And I would love, I'm sure people on this webinar have done a lot of different creative things too, and it'd be awesome to hear from others some different things that you've been able to do.
Thank you so much, Israel. Yeah, this is really getting me thinking about how candidate engagement isn't just like capturing candidates' opinions in one moment. It's not something static, but it's really this whole ecosystem of engaging the media and live tweeting on, live tweeting town halls and showing that voters who care about housing and homelessness are an active constituency. So it's educating about their views, but it's also pushing them and empowering them. So I really appreciate that perspective on how all these different aspects of elections and engaging with candidates are interconnected and kind of showing our power. We have some questions coming in from the audience. So we have a really great question. What methods of candidate engagement can help center residents and community members rather than the candidates themselves?
I mean, I think that oftentimes, depending on what kind of platform or medium you're using, I think always obviously having people with lived experience be able to provide questions, to be able to be a part of the process and helping either develop those questions or participate in those questions. And I think that, being able to provide a scenario or provide some person's experience and then ask the question helps give context. And that's a great way to be able to use all the great messaging that we've heard, but also to be able to tell people's stories. You want to keep it short and concise and moving along, but you also want to be able to provide the opportunity to listen to people's stories, because that's what matters the most. Oftentimes, these questions and answers are framed in such a technocratic way. So being able to provide storytelling through your questions and providing a scenario of what would you do, how would you handle this as an elected official provides a great opportunity to be able to tell that larger narrative.
Yeah, that's a really great point. We also got a question, do op-eds authored by service providers and housing sector leaders or letters to the editor from community members with lived experience help shape the public narrative during an election?
That's a $1 million question. I believe that unexpected messengers are more powerful than housing leaders. Now, obviously there's going to be scenarios where housing leaders are going to be talking to a big media outlet or need to be able to provide that perspective. But I think leading with people with lived experience, but also leading with people who are your allies, that they're not going to expect a housing message coming from your local fire bureau chief or your small business owner or people that you may be engaging that have their own unique story of lived experience or poverty or whatever it may mean. So I think providing unexpected I call them unexpected messengers, but I've seen that be really powerful, especially locally, when people identify with a certain person or personality in a small town or somebody who they may not expect to be that message of housing, oftentimes can have a greater impact than me getting up and talking about how important housing is. So it's being creative depending on where you are. I think just if you're an organization that's just talking about a program that funds you, I think that you need to figure out ways to not have the executive director delivering that message, because I think in today's climate, the right is I can't be nonpartisan. The people that do not believe that housing is a public infrastructure hone in on the industry that wants to kind of advocate for themselves. And so I think, again, trying to be really creative about who's delivering your message can be really impactful.
Totally. And kind of on that point, I'm realizing now that maybe not everyone is familiar with the INSP and kind of street papers and the role they play in the community. So could you just speak a bit more broadly about street papers and their role? And then if there are any kind of specifics in like specific street papers that have really taken a lead on election coverage, I'd love to hear about those specifics too.
Well, like I said in the beginning, we're newspapers that cover issues of homelessness and housing, but also cover a wide variety of social justice issues. And the newspapers are sold on the street by people experiencing homelessness and poverty, to either provide them with survival on the streets or to help improve their quality of life if they're in housing. So street papers are about a 25-year-old movement. We're a growing movement. There's just a paper launched in Boise, Idaho, just 2 weeks ago, and Wheeling, West Virginia is getting a street paper. So we're constantly adding street papers. And for people that aren't familiar with the model, I work for an organization that helps existing street papers, but also helps new street papers launch in their communities. So if you don't have a street paper in your community and that's something you're interested in, we're here to be able to help support that. We've used, we do exactly kind of where we we have a roundtable with different thought leaders and civic leaders and people with lived experience, and oftentimes street papers have interviewed all the candidates. Sometimes we wait until the primary, sometimes street papers don't. So sometimes there's 20 candidates, sometimes there's 2, just depending on the scenario. But street papers are constantly engaged in elections issues, and really just it's a chance. The election season is also just a chance to really, really push the message that housing is a public infrastructure, that housing is a top-tiered issue in our community. I mean, all the things that we already know, it's just a chance to be able to put it front and center. So street papers try to do that, and really push other media outlets to do as well. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, our local street paper here in DC is Street Sense, and I definitely use their candidate guide to help inform my choices in our most recent election. Kind of on a related note, so we've spent a lot of this webinar series and a lot of our Homes, Our Votes talking about empowering voters who are less likely to participate and closing the voter turnout gap. Do you see that increased attention to housing and homelessness in the election and the campaign can be motivating? Can it bring in voters that might not be paying attention? Like, how are you translating this candidate engagement into voter engagement?
Well, I mean, I think that, housing is everybody knows that locally housing is a top tiered issue. And I think the challenge becomes for all of us nationally, where people continue to not make it a top tiered issue. But I think that, locally, we're out west, our headquarters is out west. And so, we see housing transcend political ideologies, whether you're in a conservative community that has a large number of people sleeping in the national forest, whether you've been affected by the recent wildfires and you're a dyed-in-the-wool Republican who's lost everything in a trailer park and is now sleeping in a local shelter because of the forest fires, or whether you're a bleeding heart liberal in a Western city. We're seeing universally the messages around housing transcend any kind of political divide. And so I oftentimes wish housing was used more by our federal legislators, because we know that all the things that we know, that everybody believes that they deserve a roof over their head and a safe place to call home. So it's just a chance to reinforce those things, whether you're in a conservative or a liberal environment.
For sure. We got a question in the chat from Nelda. Are street papers always sold, or are they sometimes free in restaurants or other places? And if so, do ads support them or organizations?
Very few are provided for free. So they're mostly sold on the streets. There's different varieties of that selling, whether it be digital or cashless or an exchange of money. Almost all what makes a street paper is being able to provide that alternative income for people. And then what was the second part of that question?
Are they supported by ads or by organizations?
We're primarily supported by individuals. So Street papers don't take government money because we're a media outlet. So I would say 50% of all street papers are supported by individual giving, and then a lot of foundation support and creative earned incomes around sponsorships or events or whatever it might be. But we tend to be small entities because we don't get any kind of government funding. We don't have the ability to engage in philanthropy in some of the similar ways that our partners do that might be delivering a service or X, Y, or Z. So we're pretty much all community supported. And that's a good thing, but also a challenging thing when it comes to raising money. So
For sure. Going back to something actually that Lisa mentioned. So Lisa, if you want to weigh on this one too, you are welcome to. Have you seen local leaders who have experienced homelessness or housing insecurity running for office? And what kind of momentum is there around that sort of political leadership for people with lived experience?
This was the first one that I had personally known of. But I think, it's really, to me, impactful when people share their personal experiences as candidates and things that they've been challenged with, whether it's, housing or insecurity, or other, health challenges, personal challenges. It just really tells you more about them and humanizes them. So I'll be interested to see what these surveys tell us. And if people disclose, lived experience of different kinds, we'll be happy to share the information that they share. But offhand, that was the only one that I've experienced so far.
I think we see a lot of people that have been affected by homelessness or housing or any number of things connected to it, whether it be mental health or aging or whatever it might be. So I think that a lot of people have stories or family members or people they're connected to. It's kind of tapping into an understanding and pulling out those stories in people. And but I mean, I think that there are examples of people that with lived experience that have gone on and continue to do stuff at a local level. And I think that, as we grow as a movement and as there's more local organizing happening, that there are more and more opportunities that I think with housing being a top tiered issue locally around the country, I think you're going to see over the next decade more and more housing advocates that kind of move from housing advocate to housing advocacy to political advocacy. And I think we're seeing that to some degree, whether they have lived experience or not. I don't know.
Totally. Yeah. And I think even at the very highest levels, Representative Cori Bush speaks very openly about her own personal experience with housing insecurity. And I think that's really contributed. I think it brings a lot of power and credibility. So this is a plug for everyone here who's passionate about housing advocacy or may have lived experience to run for office someday. Just gonna scroll through the chat real quickly, see if there's more questions. We have some appreciation for your hat, Israel. A lot of gratitude. Oh, and I saw a question come in for the panelists from Marcia, asking what percentage of the homeless vote and what percentage of renters and those in affordable housing. I know the voter turnout rate among renters in 2020 was 55% compared to 71% of homeowners. And then we also have an income breakdown, although the income breakdown isn't also broken down by renters and homeowners. And then I believe, Lisa, you mentioned that about 1 in 10 people experiencing homelessness vote. Maybe you could speak more to that.
The statistic that we had, was while 60% may be eligible to vote, 1 in 3 are actually registered, and only about 1 in 10 or 10% actually do vote. So I think the challenges to all of us that work in various helping professions and human service arenas is to try and make it easy for everyone, but specifically targeting the people that are the least likely to vote, most marginalized populations. And so the statistic that I got was from the U.S. News and World Report, and they have a bunch of really good statistics. So we really tried to promote our absentee ballot, which is Michigan's early voting, vote at home, because we don't have early voting here, even though potentially we might in coming years. But this year, anybody could request an absentee ballot without, a reason at all. They didn't have to cite a reason. And so we really pushed that out. We had the QR code at the event that we did in Detroit. We had the copies of the absentee ballot application as well as the voter registration form. But people can walk in the day of the election to their clerk's office and vote by absentee ballot anytime. So it's really, I think, information that people don't realize, at least it's not publicized much. So we're trying to do that and really get to the population of folks that don't vote very often. I had somebody at the event in Detroit come up to me and say, I haven't voted since 1984. And I said, well, why is that? And he said, just nobody, none of the candidates really grabbed me. And I said, you know what? You don't really have to vote for every single, ballot race. You can vote for some of the ballot initiatives if there's something there that really speaks to you, or you can, vote for a couple candidates and not every race. So it's really unfortunate. I know your statistics, some of your graphs really bore that out, that people just were not interested. So I think part of it is to help inform and educate on what is on the ballot that may be of interest to them, and really try and grab people's attention so that they are compelled to vote.
Thank you. I also just want to uplift a comment that came through in the chat a little while ago that I'm gonna try to find. This was from Marcia, pointing out that local League of Women Voters organizations publish nonpartisan voter guides on vote411.org, and you can contact them to ask them to consider asking a question about housing in their surveys to candidates for the guides, and also to include questions in any public forums and debates. I think that's a really important point, because putting together the candidate questionnaire and hosting events it's a lot of work, and we may not all be in the place right now where we have the capacity to undertake that, but even just partnering with a local organization that's already doing forums or doing questionnaires and getting housing included on that agenda can be a really powerful way to get candidates, to make candidates' opinions known. So really appreciate that comment as well. And then I also saw a question, how is not having an address handled for voting? I'll plug that our webinar on August 22nd will be entirely focused on voting for people experiencing homelessness. Lisa, if you want to chime in on that right now, you're welcome to, but we'll cover that in greater depth in a few weeks.
Sure. We also have a little video. It's about 2 minutes long by our Secretary of State on our website. So people can vote without an address. They can use a shelter address. They can use the nearest street corner if they're, living outside. And there's a lot of different forms of identification. It doesn't have to be a state issued identification. We recently asked our clerks if our homeless management information system ID, which in Michigan has a picture on it, is acceptable, and they said yes. So we really were happy with that. So we've tried to push that information out as well to encourage people that you don't have to have an address to vote.
Perfect. Yeah, we can share out that video with the follow-up materials. So I'm seeing a lot of really great questions in the chat that are kind of on other topics that we're not going to have time to get into today. A lot of conversation about lie tech and NIMBYism and just so much stuff that I wish we had more time to cover. But with today's program, we're not going to have the chance to get into. So I encourage you to follow up, reach out to me or to anyone on our staff, and we would love to share what we're doing relating to all of these topics. But I think for today, I'm just going to close us out with a few announcements about resources we have available and upcoming opportunities. So thank you so much to Lisa and Israel for just all of your incredible work and for taking the time to share it with us. And I just also want to point out that NLIHC's, through our Homes Our Votes, we provide a lot of candidate engagement resources, tips, and templates. A lot of these echo the lessons that Lisa and Israel shared with us. So it will be a bit of repeated information for those who are here today, but good to have it all in one condensed place. So if you take a look on ourhomes-ourvotes.org/resource-library, you'll find a ton of resources. And there's actually a section, there's like a tab on that page specifically with candidate engagement resources. And so I've kind of spotlighted some of the ones that you'll see on there. There's an overview of candidate engagement, including important reminders for how to keep candidate engagement nonpartisan. There's tips for hosting candidate visits. There's tips for organizing successful candidate forums. There's tips for participating in a town hall. And there's actually a sample candidate questionnaire in our toolkit, including questions that you can adapt and include the statistics for your own state or city. So highly recommend taking a look at all of that. It's a ton of information, but it makes it easier to do this type of candidate engagement without reinventing the wheel. So definitely check out all those resources. See if there's any questions about any of that before closing us out. I don't think there are. And thank you to Sydney for sharing all of those links. There's just a reminder, as always, if you're interested in deepening your involvement with the Our Homes, Our Votes campaign, maybe you've been on these webinars and you want to know what's the next step, how can I get more involved, you can sign up to become an affiliate. Affiliates are nonpartisan organizations that are formally identified with the campaign and committed to carrying out its goals. So that can include tenant associations, direct service providers, tribal organizations, student groups, really anyone that is committed to this vision of more housing voters going to the polls. There's no cost to being an affiliate. You'll be able to request some swag for events, permission to use our logos and co-branded materials. You'll get more guidance and assistance from our staff, opportunities to have your work featured in our newsletters, and more. So we'll drop the sign up link if you're interested and haven't yet signed up. In addition, always just plug to follow Our Homes, Our Votes on social media and keep an eye out for our next newsletter at the end of this week. We've been on a summer schedule, so we haven't been publishing it every other week, but the July edition is going to come out at the end of this week, and there's a ton of really great stuff in there. In terms of upcoming schedule, next week we have the bi-weekly Housed National Call, so we'll drop the registration link for that. And then the following week, our call will be Monday, August 8th, same time slot as usual, and it will be focused on educating voters about what they need to show up at the polls or vote by mail and have all the information that they need to vote with confidence. The panel will feature Kristen Langworthy from the Housing Network of Rhode Island, who I know is in the audience today, Sandra Dennis from the Miami Workers Center, and Owen Hutchinson from Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness. So the learning continues. Hope to see all of you there. That brings us to the end for today. Unless we have any additional questions, feel free to stick around if you want to ask anything, but really appreciate all of you, appreciate all of your engagement, and appreciate our panelists. I'm seeing one new question in the chat. Is there a top priority list of federal questions? I would say that it's always changing depending on what's happening in Congress, but the ones that we have in the voter and candidate engagement guide are pretty evergreen, and they can be filled in with questions about specific legislation that's moving, but they really address the key themes that are most important for supporting policies that address the housing needs of the lowest income people. Okay, thank you so much, everyone.